whenever I happen to record a video about some negative incident in our modern church life, commentators appear who write something like, well, now the atheists are going to use this. They use the story of this negative fact for their anti-religious and anti-church propaganda. And indeed, atheists, strange as it may seem, do use this. And even more than that, pointing to the various sins committed by clergy is one of the pillars of atheistic propaganda, so to speak. And what's even more surprising, you find believers, or people who consider themselves believers, who are impressed by these methods. I don't even know if you can call them arguments. Why do I find this so surprising? Because this technique doesn't hold up to any criticism. Just think about it. An atheist assumes that I, a believer, should stop being a believer and become an atheist, adopt his worldview, if I learn that some nasty thing was done by some person. But this raises the question, first of all, are there no people among atheists who commit similar nasty things? There are plenty of them. And by that logic, believers could just as successfully use this argument or this technique against atheists. Imagine a scenario where a believer friend says to an atheist, all right, that's it. Tomorrow you're going to church, you're going to be a believer now. The atheist asks, and why on earth should I become a believer? And the believer says, what do you mean, why? You call yourself an atheist, right? Do you know what atheists have done in history and today? Want an example? Read about what happened in the Vendée, in Mexico, the Soviet Union, Albania, in a whole bunch of countries or states or territories where atheism became the ruling ideology. And even without that, in other countries, there are plenty of atheist villains. So basically, this argument can easily be turned back on the atheists themselves. And by the way, if you turn it back on them and start pointing out, well, what's your take on this? What about these crimes committed by atheists? You'll often hear, oh, well, those weren't the real atheists. They were the wrong kind of atheists who had the wrong kind of atheism. And so, supposedly, the responsibility for these crimes shouldn't be extended to or shared by the particular atheist we're talking to. Of course, it's funny that they don't apply this same logic to believers, even though you could perfectly well say the same thing. Why not say that this particular, let's say, unworthy Christian who committed one crime or another is not a real Christian? But no, when atheists talk about believers, not just Christians, but believers of all religions, according to their logic, they must all bear collective responsibility for everything that some believer did, somewhere, at some time. But atheists supposedly don't have to bear such responsibility for what atheists once did or are doing now. In fact, this argument or this tactic of atheists would have a right to exist only in one case. If in Christianity, well, we are now talking mainly about Christianity, if in Christianity there was a teaching, let's say, about the infallibility of all Christians or the infallibility of all priests. However, not only does Christianity lack this teaching, but what's more, there are direct warnings that unworthy people not only can exist, but do exist and will exist, including among the clergy and among people who hold various positions in the church. And by and large, this isn't said somewhere in some kind of secret sources or obscure pamphlets. It is stated directly in the Holy Scripture. For example, the Apostle Paul says, "For I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things, to draw away the disciples after them." That is, the Apostle here says directly that there not only can be, but definitely will be unworthy people in the church, who will at the same time hold the posts of pastors and so on, and will in fact be ravenous wolves. And this is mentioned not only in the Holy Scripture, but also in the Holy Tradition. When an Orthodox Christian opens the writings of the Holy Fathers, begins to read about this, opens the lives of the saints, he inevitably, one way or another, encounters this topic. I will give one example. Here are the writings of the Venerable Isidore of Pelusium. The Venerable Isidore repeatedly denounced the sins of the clergy of his time from the city of, well, his diocese, yes, to which he belonged, the city of Pelusium. And in particular, one can mention his letters to the bishop, first admonishing him not to ordain unworthy people, and then denouncing him for having ordained them. And so, for example, the Venerable Isidore, he first asked that Bishop Eusebius not ordain Zosimus, a very unworthy man. However, Bishop Eusebius ordained Zosimus. Then he ordained another unworthy man by the name of Maron. He ordained him to the holy orders. And here is what the Venerable Isidore writes on this matter. You have wonderfully studied the word of the psalm and gathered the like-minded into the house of the Lord, adding Meron to Zosimus, applying, I think, all your efforts so that nothing worthless remains outside the altar. Therefore know that by multiplying the number of Simons who think to acquire the Spirit of God for money, you have acquired for yourself a common vessel with that traitor. And here is what he wrote to the priest Zosimus. Great, they say, are the sins of your youth, and how could they not be great? But it is impossible to surpass the sins of your old age. For in old age to outshine young men who have become famous for their debauchery, this exceeds all measure of indecency. Therefore excommunicate yourself from the divine altar, lest lightning strike your head. This is how he describes the results of Bishop Eusebius's tenure in the see. The priesthood became venal. Arbitrariness appeared in the church. Honest people were condemned to exile, while those who should not have even stepped on the church threshold received approval, and the divine and ineffable mysteries were entrusted to them. Also, they embezzled church money and spent it to please their own ambition, and they took revenge, even to the point of bloodshed, on those who dared to stand up for virtue. That is, as we can see, the presence of unworthy people among the clergy is not some secret sealed with 7 seals, but something that is directly written in both the Holy Scripture and the holy tradition of the Orthodox Church. Therefore, how can any particular confirmation of this truth, as it is known from the official records of the church books, possibly refute the Orthodox faith, or, even more so, serve as an argument for changing a believer's worldview to that of an atheist, especially when, among atheists, there are certainly plenty of people with the exact same sins? Where is the logic in this reasoning? Moreover, let's say, were there really no villains among doctors? So there were quite a few. Terrible things were committed by people in the medical field. And this is well known. So what? Does this mean that we should abandon medicine? No, no one draws such a conclusion. And were there few villains among scientists? By no means few, but no one concludes from this that science is not needed. Or let's say, among teachers, were there not plenty of unworthy people who committed terrible crimes, including against their own students? There were unfortunately quite a few, but no one denies the necessity of education. But for some reason, if unworthy examples are found among the clergy, our atheist interlocutors suggest that we should conclude that this is evidence that we must deny both the priesthood and religion in principle. Where is the logic in that again? There isn't a hint of logic here. Therefore, strictly speaking, well, in my opinion, these arguments, which play well on emotions, yes, are completely helpless when it comes to logical analysis. Only people who are, well, let's say, very inattentive, perhaps ignorant, and who don't know some elementary things about their own faith, and simply about some common sense, logical judgment, and so on, can fall for them. In church books, the church is called an infirmary, that is, a hospital. And here in the church, we are all, to one degree or another, spiritually ill in one way or another. One way or another, we have spiritual and sinful problems. And just as in any hospital, unfortunately, not all patients recover. It's the same in the church. Some people don't want to be healed, some just pretend to be getting treatment, and there's nothing surprising about that. But I also want to say that if someone spends time on the internet, on various, anti-church websites, and when they read all that filth, of course, their soul becomes despondent, darkened, and filled with disgust. And that person might get the impression that everyone in the church is like that. That's not true. There have always been and still are many worthy people in the church, and the sins committed by the unworthy do not cancel out the worthiness of those true pastors, true Christians, who have always been and always will be in the Orthodox Church. As they say, a mountain is judged by its peak. Therefore, regarding any particular worldview, one should, let's say, pass judgment when you see its best representatives, not its worst. The worst representatives are about the same everywhere.